Alright, guys. So today what we're going to do is, again, continuing that mad scramble. So today we're going to try to finish the Second World War. I'm going to briefly talk, what goes on here at home, on the home front, just, because again, the Great Depression finally ends, by the way, if you can't stop giggling. This is my World War II US M1 helmet, officer's helmet, dated March 1945, and, felt appropriate. We'll see if it stays on the full 50 minutes. The thing weighs like a good 5 pounds, so I'm already heavy enough. The last thing is, hey, at least when I make a wife joke, and she comes, bashing me on the head, I got protection this time. But what we're gonna do, we're gonna talk, about the home front, the ending of the Great Depression. We're gonna talk about the war in Europe. We're not gonna be able to fight every battle. Again, that's the problem with the survey, but I do at least some general themes. Yalta, Potsdam, a couple of battles, and then we're going to get to the start of the Cold War. And then with that, we're going to finish up with the, dropping of the atomic bomb on Japan, which will end the Second World War. So if we look at the United States at home, we already left off talking about the war in the Pacific. So here in Europe, what we're going to see is that when we mobilize, okay, the peacetime draft, it's just simply not enough. The army is nowhere near big enough. I mean, 1940, before the draft, the United States Army is literally smaller than the army of fascist Romania. That's how tiny we are. So here what we're going to see is just a lot of people being drafted. It's this huge national movement. I'm trying to adjust my camera. This is making my head itch. Jeez. It's this huge national movement. And so what we're going to see is large numbers of civilians are going to be drafted. Something like 10, 11, 12 million people will eventually serve in the armed forces of the United States during the Second World War. And in fact, it's such a big thing to either want to volunteer or be drafted that those who were stamped 4F, which means they were not acceptable for military service, suicides were often common. And by the way, the term 4F actually dates from the Civil War, when you would have to tear off the old paper cartridges to load your musket, so you had to have your 4 front teeth, and so if you didn't, you were stamped 4F, which shouldn't that be like negative 4F, but whatever, details. When we're going to see this, we're going to see a lot of women going to work factory jobs. Again, you have to build all of this stuff. So we're going to see the rise of things like Rosie the Riveter, the rise of the fact that women are now going to, for the first time, play a significant role outside the home in the workforce. And this is going to be one of the things building up to second wave feminism, because after all, if you can build one of these Sherman tanks, and these would be M4A3 Shermans, it's part of this arsenal of democracy. If you can do that, you can, if you build that, then you can be paid the same as a man. You can do it in peacetime. There's no need for this separate spheres type argument. I'm going to lower my... There we go. I'm trying to scratch my head through this. The economy is going to be totally mobilized. And what we're going to see with the economy, with it being mobilized, you're not going to be able to buy any sort of consumer goods or luxury items, really. Rubber, tin, all that stuff is going to be rationed. The idea is it all has to last until victory. So you're not going to be able to buy new tires. You're not going to be able to buy fun stuff. Food will be rationed. You would literally be issued little cards that what would happen is when you would go and buy stuff, they would punch it. And so you could only buy a certain amount of stuff in a given month. Tuesdays, you couldn't buy meat. The idea is if meatless Tuesdays, if Americans didn't eat meat on Tuesdays, that's more meat that could then be sent overseas. So food's going to be rationed. Gasoline, other stuff. There's going to be all sorts of campaigns and propaganda stuff to get everybody into the war. The idea was all of society had to be mobilized. This was total warfare. And if we look at that idea of the war at home, okay, you're going to be urged to eat less. Well, that leaves me out. Or grow victory gardens. This idea, I'm sorry, this thing is itching too much. So we will put that over there. You're going to be urged, eat less, grow victory gardens, grow your own stuff. Why? Because if you're growing your own vegetables, okay, then you don't have to collect that ration, which means that's more stuff that could then be sent overseas. 15 million in the armed forces. 10, 11, 12, 15, when it's that high, 60 million or more are going to work on farms or in factories. So 75 million against a population of about 150 million. That's roughly one half of the entire population of the United States working in the war effort. Government spending by 1944 is $98 billion. That tenfold increase is enough to end the Great Depression. Wages and productivity skyrocket. Why? There's going to be all sorts of campaigns to try to get you to make, show up for work on time. Don't call in sick. Literally, it would be concerned, they would say that, well, if you're, skipping a day at work or you're being sick, you're helping the Nazis. They're going to guilt you into working. They're going to keep the wages high. They can't afford strikes. If workers strike for 2 days, okay, by, let's figure what? World War II, we make something like 35,000 B-24 Liberators. So let's say 42 to 45, so 3 years, 10,000 a year. 10,000 a year. Let's say let's make it. Let's just say we're making 1,000 planes a month. Okay, so a 3-day strike. Okay, 10% of that. That's 100 fewer planes. That is one full bomber group not equipped for war service. We cannot afford any sort of slacking in productivity. We're also going to see, and this is what's also going to trigger the civil rights movement. Around 750,000 African Americans are going to move out of the South into the North to try to find work, to get jobs in these factories, because so many people are going overseas. And so in doing so, race and discrimination transform and become a national issue instead of just it's not a Southern issue, it's now a full-on national issue. I'm a little bit behind with the multimedia, but today I'll put up a couple of videos. A couple of World War II vids, which, they're there if you want to watch them, you don't have to. But there's one I really, really, really want you to watch. It's called Crisis at Levittown. And it's going to deal, because next week is, Dead Week. But it's going to deal with this kind of rounding up to the end of, sorry, I just lost my train of thought. But it's, as we get into the civil rights movement, understand this transition to a national issue. What Crisis at Levittown is about, it's a 30-minute 1957 documentary. Because in that year, in August of 1957, one African-American man, his 2 young children, and his wife move into the city of Levittown, Pennsylvania. A town of 60,000 people, the first black family moves in, and people absolutely just lose their freaking minds. I mean, violence, all sorts of international stuff. And this documentary interviewed people who were fine with them moving in, and people not. And what we're going to see, even Northerners are going to talk about African Americans like, well, have you ever had contact with them? Well, it makes it sound like they're freaking Martians or something. This starts to break that open because now the North has to come to grips with its own racism. Are they as racist as the South? Not as racist, but it's 50 shades of racist. I mean, how not racist, how racist can you still be before you're not racist? That's the question. And the North has to come to grips with its own racism. And speaking of that racism, we're going to see a lot of that play out in the propaganda of World War II. World War II is heavily, heavily, heavily a propaganda war. And we're going to see that with propaganda, there's all sorts of... I've got a bunch here, I'll show you. But some of it's designed to get you into the war effort. Others just designed to, help you, savings bonds. Others remind you who the bad guy is. And we're going to see a clear disparity between the portrayals of the Germans and the portrayals of the Japanese. And we're going to see that part of the issue is beyond racism and beyond that, it's to try to give everybody a sense of participating. I mean, there are going to be some Disney cartoons. I might put it up if I remember, but there's one, it features Pluto and Minnie Mouse. And what it was is, well, you need to recycle tin cans and, you need to collect grease from when you cook. Don't give it to your dog. We can use that grease to make explosives. And it's like, well, if you can save this much grease in, a year, that's an extra pack of cartridges, for the soldier at the front. And the camera then pans to Mickey Mouse. Mickey Mouse with an M1 Garand shooting Japanese. I don't think that's going to be on the Disney Channel anytime soon. But, It's this idea that will grease really do that? Of course not. Of course you're not going to use bacon fat to make, powder for rifle bullets. But it's this thought of, if you tell people this, get them on board, give everybody a sense of participating, that they will then find they'll find solidarity and commonality with the cause. Some of the stuff we're going to see, things like, let's catch him with his panzers down, good old there's Hitler's butt if you ever wanted to see it. This idea, keep working at your job, making ammunition. If we keep his guns firing, we're going to beat Hitler. Or Tokyo kids say, good material waste and scrap, help to saving face for Jap. And if you look, okay, well, one, he's got a swastika on his butt, which is kind of weird. I literally just noticed that. But fangs, huge buck teeth, really thick glasses, devil ears, the bloody dagger. Look at the difference between the Japanese guy and the German. The German's portrayed as an idiot. Hitler's stupid, but he's a white guy. But with the Japanese, there's the racist component towards Asians, as well as just the anger still over Pearl Harbor. So he's almost takes on a devil-like appearance. What's the other things like, I'll carry mine too, the woman carrying her packages and her groceries with the troops behind. Why? The idea that, these soldiers at the front have to carry, 50, 60 pounds of equipment, their 10-pound rifle, all this stuff. The least you can do is carry your own stuff, because we're not making new cars. Ford right now is literally, they're building trucks for the Army. Chevy's building tanks for the Army. You're not going to make any sort of new trucks. Rubber is scarce. The military needs it, not you. Or you'll see things like, when you ride alone, you ride with Hitler. Join a car-sharing club today. I tend to ride with Ghost Hitler. I don't know why Hitler looks like Wonder Woman's airplane, but there you go. Or things like Superman, war savings bonds, and stamps do the job on the Japanazis. If the Nazis believe in pure Aryans, I don't know what a Japanazi is, but apparently that's a thing. Or we see the debut of Captain America. All this stuff that you buy it, you watch it, you interact with them. There's going to be films, movies, cartoons, comic books, posters, all this stuff. It gives everyone just a sense of belonging, a sense of community. That the war is bigger than each individual person, and so everybody can contribute somehow. So is the hope anyway. But understand, for all that there's this whole sense of community, sense of we're all American, sense of that, we have to deal with, again, the continued issue of segregated units. And with segregated units, why this is important is I won't say it's necessarily as bad as the First World War, but this is what's going to trigger the civil rights movement of the 1950s. Until 1948, the military is going to be segregated. More and more black units are allowed in combat in the Army. Before 1943, no African Americans are allowed in the Marines. That actually does change, but they're limited to defense battalions. Very few will see frontline service. 1943, we're going to see the rise of the Tuskegee Airmen. If you've ever seen Red Tails or the original movie Tuskegee Airmen, these were all black fighter pilot units. And the idea was, again, that sense of community, sense of belonging. But we're going to see racism continued. They're going to get older stuff. They're going to be passed over for promotion. They're going to get bad assignments. We're also going to see racial hatred because many people in Congress are going to convene special scientific committees, which will use all sorts of junk science to say things such as, well, African Americans are physically incapable of piloting fighter aircraft. That I've read some of the stuff like, oh, well, their blood, their veins and their arteries are too small and can't pump it. All of just junk science, just to try to further their own racial hatreds. And so what we're going to see, why this is important, why, at least I want to give some mention of this, is in light of the Holocaust, and you understand we are going to talk about the Holocaust, so please, Holocaust and the A-bomb get in this lecture, so I'll probably post a couple of World War II cartoons. That would be a good time to revisit, by the way, Donald Duck. I also apologize. I want to make what jokes I can. Maybe we should go back to this, because tell me you can't, not giggle when I'm doing this. But with World War II, I'll be able to make some jokes in the World War II class for those of you wanting to take it. but it's also, this is the worst the worst war in human history, and there's some things to make fun of, but a lot of it, it's serious. But with the Holocaust, okay, when people, especially African Americans, realize, look, we're fighting because the Nazis treat Jews like second class citizens, and that's not right. Why are we coming back to a society where we are treated like second class citizens? And so, what we're going to see is the idea of the birth of what would be called the double V campaign: victory at home, victory abroad. That if we're going to end this discrimination overseas, we should also end it in the United States as well. That, at any rate, was the hope. But even then, it takes till 1954 to start pushing for an integrated society, and it's going to integration's going to take for a while. I mean, consider this. I actually just read this the other day. Um, if you've seen the new Peanuts movie, which by the way, I love the movie Flyboys, but I'll say this: the Peanuts movie still a better representation of World War I air combat. But okay, now that that's out of the way, the character Franklin was introduced in 1968 after the assassination of Martin Luther King. And, that's 1968. This is 14 years after Brown v. Board of Education. This is 11 years after the Little Rock Nine. And what we're going to see is many newspapermen wanted to edit Franklin out, make Franklin white. Papers in the South threatened to drop Peanuts. There was at least one editor that said, look, we're perfectly fine. If you want to add a black kid, that's fine. But don't show him going to school with Charlie Brown. We're getting that in 68. Understand, racism, we're on the verge of starting to chip away at it, but it's going to take, well, I mean, let's be blunt. I'm not a Barack Obama fan, but that's just because I disagree with his politics, but I'm fully willing to admit that I know a good many people who are not Barack Obama fans because they cannot stand the fact that a black man is president. We're still dealing with racism even today. And right now, we're talking events 70 years ago. So, understand, we've got all that to look forward to. Jumping back to World War II, though, one of the things we're going to see, and again, kind of reinforcing that idea that the war is won on the Eastern Front. I mean, just look at the size over here. Yeah, there we go. Look at the size over here of just the front line on the Eastern Front. Both with, and what we're going to see is 42, 43. We're going to see, Germans, Italians, Finns, Bulgarians, Hungarians, Romanians, Slovakians, all fighting the Soviets. And Stalin wants a second front because Stalin realizes he is bearing the brunt. I mean, there's fighting in North Africa, but the German Afrika Corps under Erwin Rommel, it's always small, it's always short of stuff. I mean, literally, the guy at any one time might have 200 tanks. I mean, a handful of divisions. Whereas on the Eastern Front, I mean, just the size of the troop numbers engaged is absolutely staggering. So Stalin wants a second front. He wants the United States and Britain, the Western Allies, to do something to start diverting German troops. Now, the fact is, we see two competing ideas. Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, really liked this idea, or really hated. Sorry. Let me restate. I'm playing with my finger. I'm getting distracted here. He hated the idea. And he hated the idea because he was hardcore anti-communist. And so his thought was, let the Germans and the Soviets fight amongst each other. And then post-war, both will be more or less destroyed. But FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, however, said no, because then post-war, the Soviets won't trust us. If we launch a second front now, then maybe that will go a long way to preventing some sort of Cold War. Oops, stay tuned, that happens. Well, what we're going to see is the fact is the Western Allies were just incapable, in the sense that we don't have enough troops, enough training, enough technology. We're fighting and winning in North Africa, but we can't really start a true second front. We're going to try an invasion at Dieppe, a small little skirmishing raid, and it just doesn't work. It's mostly Canadians with some American Rangers. They try a new type of battle tank, which is the Churchill, which is too fat and slow and just sinks. Oops, that's a problem. Most of the guys are killed, wounded, or captured. And all it does is it gets the Germans to reinforce their positions in France. So we see that second front, it doesn't happen yet. We have to fight in North Africa, 42 to 43. Then we land in Italy, and Italy in September will switch sides. I mean, Italy switches sides in both world wars. It's kind of funny. You know, World War One, they're supposed to be with the Central Powers, and they go with the Allied. Here they fight for the Axis, then fight for the Allied, then have a civil war and fight amongst themselves. And you know, it's the Italians, they both lose. So what we're going to see is early on, the second front isn't really feasible. All we can do is what's called strategic bombing. And the thought was we can build a lot of airplanes. We can build, heavy bombers. And what if we bombed German cities? What if we bombed industry, infrastructure, military targets? If, a German panzer division doesn't have enough fuel to fight, maybe you don't have to fight the panzer division. That was the thought. So we're going to see that, by 1943, Britain and America working together, you can make large, colossal 1,000 plane raids. I mean, we can make what the Germans did in the Battle of Britain look absolutely pathetic. We then begin what we're calling round-the-clock bombing, where, bombing in daylight, it's effective. Like, here's a destroyed German city. I believe that's Cologne, and American B-17s. It's effective, but you're out there in the open. And early on, American fighter protection could only go into France. So bombers would have to fly, unescorted in Germany. And so what we're going to see, casualties mounted. The British said, no, we can't do this. But the United States believed that, we have a bomb site called the Norden bomb site. And it was supposedly so, literally the quote was, it's so accurate that at 10,000 feet, you could drop a bomb in a pickle barrel. I hate pickle juice as much as the next guy, so hey, it makes sense to me. Blow the hell out of them. But it's this idea that, how effective truly is it? I mean, the daylight precision bombing, the idea, you could have, say, 300 planes, we're all going to bomb the same target. If you look at this map, okay, this thing right here, this is your target, this radar installation. It's still standing, but there's bombs all over. If you have 300 planes spread out over about a 3-mile radius, they're not all dropping their bombs on the same target. So it's not that effective. We see British bombing is also not. The British, because they use night bombing, what they would do is they would send in planes, drop incendiaries, cause a fire, then everybody else would come in, fly to the fire, and then drop their bombs there. The British said if they got one bomb within 5 miles of a target area, that was effective. One bomb within 5 miles. Isn't that like saying if I put a word on the test, it's an A? It's ridiculous, but it's what they believed. So they eventually have to focus on area bombing, the bombing of German cities. And we're going to get things like, German cities are just going to be vaporized. Okay, I don't have Dresden here, sorry. But you're going to have Hamburg, Cologne, Berlin, all of these cities just destroyed. And then you resort to firebombing. Drop incendiaries, have the Americans bomb by day, the British come in, drop some at night, we bomb the next day. And we get that, February 13th, 1945. As many as 135,000 civilians will be killed. If you've ever read Slaughterhouse-Five, Kurt Vonnegut, the author was a prisoner of war in a camp nearby and actually witnessed this. And that's what really made him anti-war. But a couple of things to realize this. We're firebombing, okay? So, these are taking hundreds, if not 1,000 planes. 135,000 civilians. That is more than die in the blast alone of Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. Okay? Understand, this is more deadly than atomic bombs. That is how bad the war is getting. And the idea of total war, if total war is both the mobilization of everything, okay, where I want you to eat less, so that's more food for the troops. That also means if I bomb you and kill you, then eventually maybe your fellow civilians will have enough and push the government to end the war. That's the hope. So now, for the first time in modern, quote unquote civilized warfare, civilians are legitimate targets of war. And that brings up the issue of war crimes. You're going to have Arthur Harris, who was the chief of British Bomber Command. And he will say that in, I believe, 1943, he'll say we've got to win the war because if we don't, we are going to be guilty of war crimes. Understand that war crimes are decided by the victor, not the loser. Okay? Dropping an atomic bomb, yeah, it could probably be a war crime. Firebombing Dresden could probably be a war crime. But the victors don't prosecute themselves. So, what is it Churchill once said about history? History shall be very kind to me, for I intend to write it. Well, it's the same thing here. If we win, we get to determine what is a war crime. So we already know what we're doing is wrong, but we're going to try to do it anyway, in part because this is all we can fight back with. That is until June the 6th, 1944. And here we finally open that second front with Operation Overlord. These are the D-Day landings. And we're going to see this is the largest amphibious operation in history. Okay, we're going to, 5,000 ships, hundreds of thousands of men. I mean, we're going to put a lot of guys ashore. There's going to be 5 invasion beaches, Utah and Omaha for the United States, Gold and Sword for the British, Juno for the Canadian. And the best part is Hitler, I don't mean to make fun if you're into this, that's what it's, fine. But do you have any of those friends that are really big into astrology and they believe it as if it were the gospel, like it is true, absolute fact, and that there's a conspiracy with everything, and when it's a full moon or a super moon, then everybody goes crazy. I mean, I've got a friend like that, and apparently, literally, she gets people to pay her for fortune tellings, readings. I'm like, I should do that gig, but why I bring that up is one of the best allies we had was Adolf Hitler. And what I mean is, by this time, Hitler is fully, looking to astrology. Why? The war is going horrible. He needs someone to tell him it's going. He can turn it around. He can pull it out. And so astrologers told him that the main invasion would be at the Pas-de-Calais, which is right around here, okay, about 20 miles across from Dover. So you have all of this stuff, the largest amphibious operation in history, going ashore in Normandy, and the Germans don't release the majority of their forces. It's still heavy casualties. We're going to see at Omaha Beach alone, 3,000 dead and wounded. I mean, it's still harsh fighting. The German units that are there fight hard. But by this point in the war, Hitler was not only getting really bad advice, but had taken full control of military operations. Literally, German generals had to go through him to release panzer divisions. So despite how many, armored divisions the Germans have, at Normandy, only one, without orders, moves forward to attack the invasion. So D-Day is a smashing success. Our guys get ashore. Then, the Germans, okay, even if they'd wanted to Germans shift, can't, then the Soviets launch a summer offensive over here. And so the Germans just have to stand by while the United States takes over. Well, sorry, I just committed the Saving Private Ryan error, which, by the way, D-Day is one of those things. Americans, we like to take it for ourselves. Realistically, it's a multinational thing. Again, 3 of the 5 invasion beaches weren't even American. But people are a little too angsty. When Saving Private Ryan came out back in 2008, it dealt with American Rangers landing at Omaha Beach. And people were like, well, why doesn't this show any British participation? Because you're not in our sector. That's why, But this is something that everybody likes to claim because, this is, this is the beginning of the end for Germany. This is June the 6th, 1944. 5 months and a day later, they surrender. Or not 5 months. 11 months and a day later, they surrender. The Nazi Reich literally has less than a year to live. And by now, as we look at Fortress Europe in the West, we see that qualitative superiority is now in the hands of the United States. We simply have more stuff. German tanks are better. The Tiger tank, high velocity 88 millimeter gun. To quote a German tank commander, I believe it was Otto Carius, we could take out 6 or 7 Shermans. The problem is, there was always an 8th Sherman tank to knock us out. We simply have more stuff. We have more men, more tanks, more guns, more planes. By this stage of the war, the Germans said, a running joke would be, if you see a silver plane, it is American. If you see a green plane, it is Soviet. If you see a brown plane, it is British. And if you see an invisible plane, it is the Luftwaffe. That's how bad the Germans are doing. And so we look, and you can kind of see these dates here. By August, Paris is liberated. By September, we're at the border with Belgium. Or actually, by September, we're at the border with Holland. By December, a majority of Holland is occupied, and, we are at the border with Germany. And so it's here that now people are starting to think the war might be over by Christmas. The Germans might want terms. We might be able to end the war. And it's here that we get a little bit of victory disease. We start to bring in more and more, drafty units. And you want them to get some experience in the line. Well, we believe the Germans are beaten. By now, the rumor is old men and kids, which the Germans actually are using old men and kids. The Volksdeutsche and the Volkssturm and the Hitlerjugend. But more importantly, is right around here in the Ardennes forest. We believe this was a safe, quiet sector. We put a lot of our green newbie units in the line there. The idea, let them get some combat experience, get some training, learn their trade, learn their craft, and then they can be thrown into the line. Except on December the 16th, 1944, the Germans, once again, Hitler using his astrologers, commit one final offensive. This is it. This is the last gasp of the German army. And in fact, probably one of the bloodiest battles for the United States in the Second World War. What we're going to see is with the Battle of the Bulge, the Germans throw everything they have left. And the idea is if they can drive to the city of Antwerp, they can, if here's the British up here, here's the Americans here. If they can drive through and cut off the armies, the hope is make a large portion of the British surrender. Then if he can retake Paris, Hitler truly believes at this point that he can get the United States to agree to a separate peace and that we will fight alongside him to fight the Russians. Hitler believed that it would the destiny of the United States to realize the Soviets, not the Nazis, were the true enemy. So he commits this major offensive, and he picks it at a time with bad weather. Why? Because German tanks are so good, we typically have to rely on air power to take them out. But if it's snowing and foggy, planes can't fly. So the Germans begin Wacht am Rhein, later renamed Autumn Mist, and the idea, just pour through, capture whatever you can. The offensive screws up almost from the very beginning. It does so because the SS, the Schutzstaffel, or more appropriately the Waffen-SS, are well known for their atrocities. And one of the things was they hoped that if they killed prisoners, that maybe it would make other people panic and flee. That was the thought. Okay, they're thinking, if you know that if you're captured, you're going to die, you'll run away. So what happens on the day after the offensive begins, December the 17th, the town of Malmedy, a number of Canadians and American engineers that have surrendered. And this battle catches us so by surprise that a full infantry regiment, among others, is forced to surrender. Prisoners are being taken right and left. About 50 to 100 guys are machine gunned by the Waffen-SS, but a few survive. And so the story gets out, and it spreads through the lines about what's called the Malmedy Massacre. And the idea is, the Germans hope to create fear, but they do something else. Instead, what happens is people say, well, look, if you surrender, you're going to die. So if you're going to die, you might as well fight and take as many of them with you as you can. And so that's what happens. And so we're going to see, the most famous bit about the Battle of the Bulge is when the American 101st Airborne Division, with some armored units, holds up here at the city of Bastogne. That's where 7 major highways intersect. The, what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 major ones here, and there's 2 minor ones not on the map. And so the Germans have to take it. But they won't surrender because they know if they surrender, they're going to die. And it causes the whole offensive to break up. By December 26th, General George Patton and his Third Army break through, relieve Bastogne. I don't know what's going on here. My thing just got possessed. Holy water, the power of Christ compels you. Okay. And what we're going to see is Bastogne is relieved and the German offensive breaks up. Within a few days, the cloud cover lifts and American planes have no problem destroying what German armor is on the road. In January, the Soviets launch a massive offensive and the German army is more or less destroyed. So why this is important is Hitler had believed there was a chance of winning the war. Some people believe, hey, there's always a chance we're going to lose. After the Battle of the Bulge, it's blatantly obvious that the United States and the Allies are going to win. The German army is shattered. It has no more attempts to mount any offensive operations. It's going to fight a lot of defensive actions, but it pretty much ensures that they will lose the war. The war has irrevocably turned at this point. So much so, and I don't want you to know too much about Yalta, but so much so that by February 1945, people are starting, the big three, the Soviets, the British, the United States, Stalin, Churchill, and FDR, are meeting to discuss the fate of post-war Europe. It's so evident we're going to win, we have to start shaping it. By now, Soviet troops are within 50 miles of Berlin, and we're going to see that the Allies give Stalin every concession he wants because we want to ensure that the Soviets will declare war and invade Manchuria, declare war on Japan, because we're still not sure how we're going to do that. February 45, we're fighting Iwo Jima right now. We know how bloody an invasion of Japan can be. We want as many allies as possible. Now, 2 things come out of this that I really want you to pay attention to, and that is that FDR and even Churchill to an extent are going to push for free elections in Eastern Europe, and particularly Poland. And the Soviet response is, my army's there. What are you going to do? You like my bad Soviet accent? In Soviet Russia, accent makes fun of you. I don't know. Okay, bad joke. If you've heard about the, by now, hopefully, this will date the lecture. I'm going to have to re-record this one in the spring now. But you've heard of how Turkey shot down the Russian Sukhoi Su-24. Just remember, as Vladimir Putin said, you might want to grab a ham for Christmas because by Christmas there's not going to be any turkey left. Okay. Bad joke. Honestly, really, the Russians and the Turks have fought for centuries, and Turkey's still there, so nothing's going to happen there. But what we're going to see is, so Stalin says no. And bear in mind, that was the one thing, remember, that Britain declared war back in 1939. They want a free Poland. And they're not going to get. Poland's just going to have to go from Nazi domination to Soviet domination. I'm sitting here doing, the hand movement so you can't see it, but, Nazi to Soviet domination. The other is if you look at the picture of the big three, okay, Stalin has that look of, these guys are idiots. Churchill's like, get this stupid conference over the whiskey bar. And FDR is not looking so good. I mean, he's kind of looking like a shriveled up Skeletor right now. And he's going to, this is February. FDR is exhausted. And he's going to die in April 1945. And Hitler's going to be so delusional, he'll say, that's it. This is how I know that we're going to win the war. No. But understand, with FDR's death, now we're going to have Truman come in. And so that distrust between the big three, it's going to happen. And, there's going to be all sorts of shakeups. And it's to realize that now that we're planning for that post-war world, but the people who have tried to make that post-war world are not going to be there. Churchill's going to be voted out of office. FDR is going to die. Only Stalin will remain. Now's the part where we have to get a little sad. And we need to talk about the Holocaust. Understand that we knew of the Holocaust from 1940, at least 1940, or at least Jewish persecution since the 30s. We knew something of the exterminations. We didn't know how widespread, but as we start liberating Germany, and more importantly, as the Soviets start liberating Eastern Europe, we start to find the concentration camps. And we realize just how bad things had been. The Germans had had an anti-Soviet policy since the an anti-Jewish policy since the 1930s. Okay, very soon after the Nazis get into power, you get the Nuremberg laws, which said, okay, this much drop, that person's a Jew. If they're a Jew, here are their rights in society. Here's who they can marry. Sexual relations between Jews and non-Jews as a capital offense. All of this stuff. Jews were deported en masse. Many tried to flee. Okay, again, consider the Syrian refugee thing. Consider this. In 39 and 40, German Jews, or 38 and 39, excuse me, fled to the United States. And in many cases were not allowed to get off the boat because the United States did not want the refugees. So many fled to the east. But then the Germans attack the east, take over Poland, take over parts of Russia. So once again, the Jews are back in the German Empire. And so at the Wannsee Conference of January 1942, and by the way, if you ever want to feel miserable for being part of the human race, watch the movie Conspiracy with Kenneth Branagh and I forget the other guy. Stanley Tucci. And what it is I believe it's Stanley Tucci. What it is, it's about the Wannsee Conference. What happens in a 2-hour meeting? The upper levels of the German government, the SS, the Schutzstaffel, and the SD, the Sicherheitsdienst, the special police, met to discuss the final solution. How were they going to deal with the Jewish problem? And they said, creating Jewish-only towns is too expensive. We can't deport them. Nobody wants them. We can't send them to places like Madagascar. So they decide on a twofold thing: extermination and slave labor. The most fit ones are going to be used for slave labor. The rest are all going to be exterminated. And not just shooting. They'd already been shooting them. Okay, there have been executions since the invasion of Poland in 1939. Now it's industrialized warfare. Now it's the gas chambers. And what we're going to see is understand. Well, I'm just, this is these extermination camps, Auschwitz, Buchenwald, Dachau. If we look at Auschwitz, okay, the rail lines would lead in. What they would do is they'd stop the train. You would, dump your belongings, and then you would go into what looked like, group showers. You'd take off your shoes and stuff, and then you would be gassed with Zyklon B. And then what they would do is they would leave the bodies there, cram more people in, gas them, then cram more people in and gas them. And, millions are going to be killed in this way. Despite the fact we live in societies where many people want to say the Holocaust did not happen, the rough numbers are between 5 and 6 million Jews, 3 million Soviet prisoners of war, 4 million Soviet, Polish, Yugoslavian civilians, gypsies, Romani, homosexuals, mentally disabled. Literally, the Germans are using gas and chemical stuff to kill mentally ill people in the early 30s. I mean, anybody who was socially undesirable. And here's part of the problem where we as humanity have to come to grips with it. Again, the Germans are still paying war reparations. This is in part why the State of Israel will be created. People often want to say it doesn't happen. I'll just simply quote a German officer that talked to a friend of mine once. We didn't kill that many Jews, but we tried. Understand, this happened. This was absolutely horrific. But we as a society, an American society, have to come to grips with that. Anybody want to drive a Porsche? Okay. Ferdinand Porsche used Jewish slave labor in his factories, building tanks and stuff. Okay. Anybody know who Werner von Braun is? Werner von Braun was an SS Obersturmbannführer who used Jewish slave labor at Peenemünde for his rocket experiments to build the V1 and V2 rockets. And rather than face war crimes trial, Werner von Braun later became the head of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. And without an ex-SS Obersturmbannführer, we would not have landed on the moon. So understand that, the Holocaust is absolutely horrific. But, I'm trying to think of how to say this. And I'm not going to lie, this is the first time I've ever struggled to try to figure out how to do this in a video. One of the challenges of teaching online is, you guys aren't here. Which, by the way, you guys have been a great class. And, thanks for putting up with this. My first time teaching online. And I really wish I could have gotten to meet all of you. I've met a couple of you guys that have come into the office. Wish I could have met all of you. But, keep in touch. Drop me a line. Let me know how you're doing, after the semester. But, one of the things this hard is it's hard to gauge the crowd's reaction. It's hard to look. But just understand, this is extermination. This is humanity at its worst. And while there are a few bright spots and things like guys like Werner von Braun and, us going to the moon, understand, 99.99%, this is absolute. This is humanity at its base level. And the world knew. Okay, I believe it was early 41. An interesting Humphrey Bogart movie, All Through the Night. And it's a gangster flick. But there's a scene in there where, and it deals with a German spy ring in pre-war America. And he sees this woman who's German spy, and, he's going to think, and he asks, Dachau, Dachau, what's that? We knew about the Holocaust, and we did nothing. And, the Germans are trying to atone for it. The Japanese are trying to atone for their atrocities. But it's understand, although these events are 70 years ago, the repercussions are still felt through the world. And, this is humanity at its absolute lowest. So please, one thing I usually like to say is, and especially we see this with election years, and I gave this spiel back in, 2013, I believe. One of the things is we like, with propaganda and stuff like that, we like to demonize people that disagree with us, people that aren't like us, people, so whether it be Muslims, or, one of the things we'll probably see on Facebook, politics, Republicans, libtards, don't demonize people. OU fans even, don't demonize them. Why? Because when you dehumanization, it's the first step. And it starts out, maybe, innocent, but then if you truly believe in your own spiel and you don't listen to what people have to say, you dehumanize them. That's how stuff like this happens. Remember, the Jews, the Slavs, why they could do this? They were Untermensch, subhuman. They were not on the same plane. Understand, Joseph Stalin once said that the death of one is a tragedy. The death of a million is but a statistic. And that's because the human brain, we can wrap our heads around the death of one, but not around large statistics. And with the Holocaust, 13 million people, not counting, others. I can't wrap my head around that. But understand, this is humanity at its lowest. And so understand, it's our jobs. Okay, even if we didn't do this, even if we had nothing, it's our jobs to ensure this never happens again, because it always can. What is it? The old quote. All it takes for. Sorry, I just binge watched Man in the High Castle. So maybe that's why I'm on my soapbox. Fantastic series, by the way, but it'll creep you the hell out. All that it takes for evil is for good men to do nothing, or something to that effect. Understand, it's our job to make sure that this never happens again. It's 50 minutes, but we've still got some stuff to go, so hopefully we can wrap this up in about an hour or so. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but understand that when the Germans surrendered, okay, Hitler's going to shoot himself April 30. Karl Dönitz, who had been the chief of the U-boat arm, becomes the second Fuhrer. And as the Soviets took cities in Germany. Okay, as retribution for all of the war crimes, the Germans were subject to theft, murder, rape. As the saying went, no German woman aged 7 to 70 was safe from being raped by Soviet troops. And the fact is, the Soviet officers did nothing. They let this happen. This was how they let the men just kind of get this out of their system. And so what would happen is Germany people tried to flee to the west. They wanted to surrender to the Allies. And finally, they surrendered to everybody. And on May the 7th is VE Day. Germany will surrender unconditionally to the Allies and the Soviet Union. Now, I want to briefly talk about the Potsdam Conference because this is the start of the Cold War. And I'll bring this up in the Cold War lecture, which will be next time. But at Potsdam, this is June of 45. And what happens is, remember how FDR is dead. He's replaced by Harry S. Truman. Stalin's still there, but Clement Attlee replaces Winston Churchill. And the idea is, okay, now that the war is over, what are we going to do post-war? And so the thought was, okay, well, how do we, make this different than Versailles? We don't want to pay for the Germans, but we don't want another harsh peace. But there's also, we start dividing up Europe. We start to say, okay, this is going to be Western Germany. This is going to be Eastern Germany. This is what we want freedom and democracy. You guys can go make this a communist satellite. And then that distrust pops out. By now, the atomic bomb has been exploded. And Truman told Stalin, we have a weapon we can use in the Pacific that can vaporize a whole city. We think it can end the war quickly. And Stalin, in broken English, said, I know. Soviet spies had already detected the atomic bomb. They already knew we had this thing. And so this is the beginning of a Cold War. Because understand, you take the two now biggest militaries in Europe. They're now like this, right next to each other. One is nuclear armed, and both believe the other cannot coexist. Remember, if you're communist, everybody has to be communist. We all have to be the same, or we're not going to want to do anything. But if you're capitalist, okay, then we all have to want freedom, democracy, and communism is the antithesis. We're going to call it the monolithic evil. So there's the questions of, is this going to be a Cold War that will eventually go hot into World War III? And it doesn't. But understand, for 46 years, between 1945 and 1991, the world kind of holds its breath and waits. And in part because now we have a newer and deadlier weapon. Project Manhattan. And when I talk about Project Manhattan, I also want, this is developing the atomic bomb. Mention this in that Hiroshima and Nagasaki ID term. You need to mention both. This is probably the most expensive single program the United States devised in the Second World War. $2 billion. Remember, out of a $98 billion total. And it was highly secret, despite the fact that there were camps all over the United States working on this. Truman, as vice president, didn't even know of its existence. That is how bad, how secretive this was. And the thing is, it relies on nuclear fission, splitting of the atom. Do that, harness it into an atomic weapon. Now, what we're going to see, never mind about Hiroshima being the first nuclear bomb. That's the first one dropped. That's not the first one exploded. Now, understand, we build this thing. It's expensive. But people tried to tell Truman, don't use this. There were some scientists that said there was about a 2% chance that this would incinerate the atmosphere and destroy the planet. Politicians, drop the thing anyway. Which, hey, just remember, we vote for these assholes. Remember that. There's also the issue of, this is kind of, people say it was like a genie. Once it's out, once you explode this, you can never go back. This is a watershed. But Truman said, look, what do I tell the mother whose Marine son died invading Japan? That we had a weapon that could end the war, and we didn't use it. What do I tell the American taxpayer who spent $2 billion on this thing, that we built this and never used it? What do I tell them? So Truman says he had no problem using this thing. But understand, this is the moment when humanity changes. Not always for the best either. July 16, 1945, the Gadget is exploded at Trinity, New Mexico. It is the first man-made atomic bomb in history. And there's a story that comes out of it that's really crazy, and I want you to put yourself. There was a woman, a little girl actually, who lived about 100 miles away. She was blind from birth. She never saw anything in her life save one thing. July 16, 1945, the device, they actually did not call these things bombs until the 60s. The device detonates. And there's a bright flash in the sky, even 100 miles away. And the little girl looked up at her parent, felt around, called out to her parents, and parents came over, and she said, "What was that?" The only thing this little girl ever saw in her entire life was the flash of an atomic bomb. That is the world. July. Remember that date, July the 16th, 1945. That's when we created the modern world. For all of the good scientific benefits and the deadly reality that numerous times we came close to nuclear Armageddon, that is the world that we brought ourselves into. And so with that, we get the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Here's the thing, the Japanese, despite what George Takei likes to say on his Facebook, despite what a lot of people like to say, the Japanese were not ready and willing to surrender. Get that out of your heads right now. And I'll prove it if you just give me a few minutes. To try to get them to surrender, though, we are firebombing the hell out of their cities, just like we do in Dresden. 9 to 10 March 1945, Operation Meeting House. We have 330 B-29s. These are, huge bombers that can fly from the Marianas to Japan and back. And in Operation Meeting House, it's a huge firebombing raid. 1 million people homeless. 1/4 of Tokyo will be destroyed. 100,000 dead. It is the deadliest single air raid in history. More people die here than in either atomic bombing. Now here's the thing. That's 330 planes. That's a lot of material, but we can do it. We can project that kind of power. But that pales in comparison to when, and the army selects cities that have not been touched. They're like, beyond anything more, we want to see what effect having a nuclear detonation against the target will have. The Gadget was just exploded out in the middle of nowhere. August the 6th, 1945, a B-29 named Enola Gay, which you can still see at the Smithsonian Institute, carried an 18-kiloton nuclear bomb, Little Boy. Drops it, and it explodes over Hiroshima. Instantly, 66,000 people dead. 69,000 people wounded. What does it look like? Not going to lie to you, I cannot tell the difference really between Tokyo on the left after Meeting House and Hiroshima on the right. Absolutely deadly. The Japanese don't surrender. We plead for them to. We say we're going to keep dropping a rain of atomic bombs on them. We tell them this via radio. They don't surrender. So on August the 9th, 1945, another B-29 named Boxcar flies over a Japanese city, Kokura. Kokura is obscured by clouds, so it shifts to its secondary target. When it arrives over Nagasaki, drops the 21-kiloton bomb, Fat Man, which explodes and kills another 40,000 people. Nagasaki is smaller. It's also protected by hills and mountains. That's why, it wasn't as bad. But 2 planes, 2 weapons, and 106,000 people dead. Probably an equivalent number wounded, and that's before we get to the radiation poisoning. Now, the significance, this ends the Second World War. That is the significance. I don't care how you can disagree with me whether it was just we dropped them. You can disagree with me whether it saved lives. But here's the thing. It ends the Second World War. Because on August the 9th, 1945 as well, the Soviets cross the border and invade Manchuria. And it's just overwhelming. Before we get to that, though, I want to introduce you to Tsutomu Yamaguchi, who is either the luckiest person alive or the unluckiest person alive. It's however you want to phrase it. Yamaguchi was in Hiroshima on business, where he was a couple of miles away from ground zero. Bomb detonates, and he survives the blast. So on August the 7th, he says would be the Japanese equivalent to, I'm getting the hell out of this effing place, and leaves. We're on August the 9th. He arrives home in Nagasaki, where again he is a couple of miles from ground zero. He is the only confirmed survivor of both atomic blasts. They think there may have been as many as 18, but he is the only confirmed one. Now here's the thing, in Japanese society, because of the radiation, because of the birth defects, all that, they're called hibukashas. They are outcasts from societies. He's technically a double hibukasha. And it's because the Japanese just see if you're irradiated, you are now damaged goods. You're now substantially different from the rest of society. And so that's why he as a two-time nuclear survivor is hardcore against nuclear weapons. Now, I'm waiting because I'm willing to bet, and there's no shame in this happens all the time. Many of you, and I wanted to show you just how desensitized we are. We've just talked about the vaporization of about 106,000 people. Very few of you are probably like, nah. But this is the kind of society we are. This is how desperate the Soviets were by 1942, needing something to, stop the flood of German tanks. They take dogs, train them that food is under tanks, put a bomb on top of the dog, and train the dog to go run under tanks for food. Literally, the anti-tank dog. You literally send these things out against tanks and hope it just runs, contacts a tank, and blows it up. I really wish, this was one of those CCTV course or something, because I'm hoping at least one of you does what happens every class I do this, and we get a, not the puppy! Not gonna lie, I literally did this lecture, my first time teaching years ago, 200 student classroom. Nobody bats an eye over the nuclear weapons. Throw this up, and 4 sorority girls literally, oh, that, again, and there's no shame in it. It's just that, again, it's what Stalin said. When we start talking about thousands or millions, the human brain can't, it's like me, when I get paid, and I get paid, what, for doing, for all the classes I teach, I get, $3,400 a month. I can't conceive of that. I'm like, oh, it might as well be $1 million. We can't conceive of these numbers. And so with that, it's understand that World War II is just that costly. Okay, we're going to see, when we end the war with Japan, what causes, what does it is, okay, you've got Nagasaki. The Soviets finally invade that same day. And understand, like I said, they weren't ready to quit the war. Hirohito himself decides to end the war. The Japanese army, who has revered him as a demigod, stages a coup. They want to keep fighting. One atomic bomb, what they did is they realized that it's one of the themes, because, if you've ever watched anything by Neil deGrasse Tyson, we as human beings want to find patterns. Well, they said that a lot of the survivors of Hiroshima wear white cloth. We're wearing white. Must have been after Labor Day. Bad joke. So what they do, hey, it's before Labor Day. There we go. See, I know something about women's fashion. But they started passing out white cloth to soldiers and civilians, and literally telling people, this will protect you from the atomic bombs. Okay, after Nagasaki, they wanted to keep fighting. It took Imperial Guard troops putting down the army's revolt, and Hirohito recording a message and broadcasting it to his own people. That's what it finally took to end the war. The army, who was in control of the government, wanted to keep fighting. No, they did not have much left, but they wanted to fight and die as a nation if possible. The atomic bombs, in my view, were absolutely necessary. So on August the 15th, 1945, Japan agrees to surrender. And on September 2nd, 1945, at a ceremony in Tokyo Bay, 6 years and 1 day after German troops invade Poland, the Second World War comes to an end. And if we want to look at just the cost, okay, the Soviets, 20 million dead, 10 million of that civilians. The Chinese, another 10 million, 7.5 civilians. The Germans, 4.25 million. Japan, 2.5. Poland, almost 6, the overwhelming majority civilian. Okay, the war all told, 21 million military and 27 million civilian, plus many of the Holocaust deaths aren't even figured into these totals. Okay, this is the costliest war in human history. And the most direct significance of that was not, ending fascism is dead, Nazism is dead, but the most direct consequence is as soon as it's done, post-war Germany gets divided between the British, the Americans, the French, the Soviets. A Cold War springs up. And now, once again, you have an interlocking alliance system. You have two competing superpowers. You have the threats of war. But now, by 1949, both sides will have access to nuclear bombs. And it's potentially a lot more deadly. So on that note, I'm sorry it ran a little long, but that'll call it good for this one. What we're going to do for the rest of the course, I'll try to get as far on that timetable. As I said, what we might just do is I'd like to give you a lecture, intro to the Cold War. I'd like to touch on civil rights. We may or may not do Vietnam. If we don't do Vietnam, I will probably at least get us through just the Cold War headaches that are going to define American history until 1991, because it's the Cold War that really, that sets up, that is the direct progenitor of the world we live in. Decolonization absolutely sucks, and that's why we have a lot of the turmoil in the Middle East, is understand with the Cold War, and I'll use the FDR quote about South America, is a lot of it, it's a power game, it's an influence game. We need, to influence this country to not be communist or use them against the Soviets. The Soviets need to do that against us. And we abandon our morals in many cases. To quote FDR again, using the quote, I believe it was about Nicaragua. Well, he might be a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. And so we're going to see this worldwide geopolitics game trying to circumvent nuclear war, but with the result that nobody pays any attention as to what's going to happen at the end. So we've got that to look forward to. Again, sorry it wasn't too much jokes. World War II, it's one of those things. There's some things we can joke about, but in the uber short, condensed, just add water version, there's not really much we can do. So on that note, have a good one. Have a good dead week. If there's anything I can do, let me know. Give me a shout, and we'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.